Congratulations and welcome to our conference, Dr. Scruggs, who's an assistant professor of global studies. Before joining the department, she held positions over the years in academia, at NGOs, and in government, including having served for nearly 5 years as principal advisor on research to Ambassador Susan Rice, Ambassador Samantha Power, and Ambassador Nikki Haley at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. She has an interdisciplinary PhD in African diaspora studies with a focus on global migration, and was a Ford Foundation Fellow, Rotary Ambassador Fellow, and Fulbright Scholar. So thank you for accepting our invitation, and welcome to our conference.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm going to be a little repetitive because I added a slide to drive home a few of the points. So I thought you did a great job at introducing me. Nothing more really to say.
Okay.
I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this works correctly. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm just going to put it in. All right, hopefully this will, sorry guys. Can you see the right view? I'm sorry.
Yes, we can see that. No, we're seeing your presenter view. So maybe you'll have to do.
Yeah, I have to go back out. I'm sorry. I had a little emergency before this, but I was determined to get here. So how about, how is that view?
Yes, that works.
Is that okay?
Yes.
All right. So thank you so much for having me today. Again, I apologize if I'm a little harried. I had a bit of an emergency before this, but I want to talk to you today about undocumented Black immigrants, underrepresentation, and lack of protection. My main goal of this talk is actually to situate contemporary Black undocumented immigrants, who I call BUIs, within the larger context of US immigration and racial history. And why do I do this? Some people say, well, what do we care? We want to hear about what's happening to them today, right now, what can be done. I think that is important. Obviously, we want to know what's happening contemporarily, but I think we cannot fully understand their predicament today without understanding the complicated cocktail of race and politics, which has very deep roots in the US and still informs US immigration policy formation and immigrant integration today. So the basis of my expertise or my views, I like to tell people this because sometimes I don't necessarily sound like what folks are used to hearing, but my views have come about because of a combination of my formal education and my lived experiences. And that includes, I'm a multi-generational Black American. So I descend from those people who were trafficked into the United States beginning in 1619. I have a PhD in African diaspora studies from UC Berkeley. I have a master's degrees in African American studies at UC Berkeley, and a master's in political science with a focus on Africa from Boston University. I spent 5 years as chief of the research unit at the US mission to the United Nations, 3 years as an asylum officer and an immigration officer at USCIS at the Department of Homeland Security, 2 years living in Egypt, where I worked as a legal advisor to refugees. So I worked mostly with UNHCR and the US Embassy. 1 year living in Cote d'Ivoire, working at the US Embassy in Abidjan. I've traveled to 50 countries, and I've volunteered at International Rescue Committee, Somali Development Center, and Amnesty International. And I say that because I look at immigration policy, how it affects people's lives, how people integrate, the problems that they face from many different vantage points. And it's because of all those things that I just shared with you. American immigration laws can be best understood if they're broken down into two segments, and that is pre-1965 and post-1965. I tend to, again, emphasize the historical part because a lot of African and Caribbean and other immigrants from all over the country know what's going on now. They know what's happening to them. They do not understand, and they're not really good at connecting the dots between what is happening now and the historical precedents that happened before they arrived. Pre-1965, so basically mid-1500s into the 20th century, most immigration was overwhelmingly European, people of European descent. Alongside Europeans were Africans. I told you I descend from those people. They were captives, human trafficked, enslaved, and that occurred from 1619 to 1865, so 246 years. During the colonial era, roughly 1600 to 1775, immigration was open. Any European who could come to America pretty much could stay and live here forever. Now we know that men were more favored than women, but my point is to let you know that Europeans pretty much could come and go as they wanted. Our first real immigration act was the Naturalization Act of 1790. Citizenship could be obtained by birthrights. This was the first time you had jus soli, or you could, if you weren't born here, you could naturalize. And that was also the first time that you could actually go through a process, a formal process to become American. Now, this did not include people of African descent, didn't include a whole lot of folks, but I'm focusing on people of African descent. Foreign-born residents were required to spend at least 2 years living in the US before they could apply to become a citizen. But again, there was a possibility, there was a road for people, but not Black people. Many other laws were passed along the way. And again, my intention is not to cover every single one of them. I do that in classes that I teach, not today. But what I wanted to point out is that very early on in the country's development, there was already an idea of who belonged and who could belong. So this definition excluded Indigenous people or Native Americans, people of African descent, Chinese. There was a Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the list goes on. Black Americans who descended from Africans brought to the US and who had been here for hundreds of years did not receive citizenship until the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So basically, I say we because I'm from those folks, became citizens or granted citizenship in 1865. If we do quick math, I told you 1619 was when we first started being trafficked in. It's 249 years that we were considered property, not citizens. This doesn't mean that there were not non-Europeans who did make their way to the United States and managed to settle. Obviously, there are always exceptions to the rule, but by and large, there were, again, it was mostly people of European descent who were allowed to do that. Post-1965, the civil rights movement spurred changes in US immigration law that helped to shift the demographics. A lot of students I teach who are the children of immigrants or who just immigrated here have no idea that they benefited royally from the same civil rights movement that they associate with Martin Luther King and the American South and, separate water fountains and things like that. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which is also called the Hart-Celler Act, abolished the national origin quota system and raised the ceiling on immigrant admission. So more people were allowed to come in and they took the quotas off. So it wasn't, only this number of people can come from this country and blah, blah, blah. For the first time also, there was a shift in the source of immigration flows. So there was a shift away from European nations to Asian, African, Latin American, et cetera, countries. It was an explicit reversal of decades of systemically exclusive and restrictive immigration policies that denied non-Europeans entry into the US. I'm sorry, okay. And also I lost track. The Refugee Act of 1980 adopted the definition of refugee put forth by the UNHCR. So this was the first time in US domestic law, the first time that we as a nation complied with international law. Before that, we just made up our own immigration laws and did not worry about what was going on in the world, never really tied it to any international laws. But by doing this, we were fulfilling legal obligations outlined in the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Refugee Protocol. So overall, the reason I bring this up is because we, not only in 1980 with that act, we standardized refugee resettlement in the US. It was, for our purposes today, it was also another way that the shift in demographics of who arrived in the US occurred. While laws shifted, social constructs remained the same. So while there was a shift in immigration laws, the social constructions around race in this country remained largely untouched. And this is particularly true for people of African descent. So a lot of Africans and people from the Caribbean who arrive today are still dealing with those same stereotypes, inescapable stereotypes and stigmas that my ancestors dealt with and that I have to deal with to varying degrees today. We are all involved in this, even if you say, well, I'm Dogon from Mali, this has nothing to do with me. That may be how you see yourself. That is not how you're seen in the United States. And there's a very long history of this sort of special treatment for people of African descent, especially visibly African descent. Black undocumented immigrants today, from 1990 to 2007, the unauthorized immigrant population more than quadrupled in size. So it went from 3.5 million to 12.2 million in 2007. I always caution that these are just estimates because we know that a lot of people live underground. So I'm never too comfortable with those numbers because we can't ever have them exact. But I think it's a good indication to know how many people are affected by our laws and our regulations. By 2017, the number had declined to 10.5 million. So it was 3.2% of the overall population at that point in 2017 was estimated to be here illegally, or you'll see some reports say unauthorized. The decline was mostly attributed to a decrease in the number of undocumented immigrants from Mexico. I think it's important to point out that there's a lot of emphasis on Mexicans, but at the same time, Mexicans from 2007 to 2017, so for a full decade, were the single largest group of unauthorized immigrants in the US. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone because Mexico borders the United States. So it makes a lot of sense in my mind. But I think when you see those numbers and you understand that they were the largest group for a decade, then you can also understand why a lot of times the emphasis is always on them. Seems to be. In March 2021, an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants were in the United States. Again, these statistics with caution, but about 11 million people are here without their papers. In September 2018, it was estimated that the undocumented immigrant population broke down as follows: 92.6% Hispanic or Latino, 3.5% Asian, 1.7% white, and 1.1% Black. So when we talk about Black undocumented immigrants, we're talking about relatively, if we go just on these statistics that we have, a very small population of people, comparatively speaking. In February 2020, it was estimated that there were 619,000 undocumented Black immigrants living in the US. But these statistics are problematic, and I say this 100 times when I present, because we don't even know who's being counted. That's the first thing. No one, oftentimes people do not unpack the Hispanic Latino category. So some people are coming from a cultural context from which they don't consider themselves Black. So when they come to the United States, they never state that they're Black on forms. They never talk about being Black because that's not how they perceive of themselves. Also, again, it's not just their own self-identification, it's how they are identified by others. Because if they check Latino or Hispanic on paper, most people are not going to unpack that. They just put them in that 92.6% population. Now, that's different from the treatment they may receive on the street. People have eyes and they can see, and they relate you to what they believe you are. But on information that's collected on paper, especially, that category of Hispanic and Latino is not often unpacked. And I just skipped ahead of myself. And many people who are here with illegal immigration status live in the shadows. That's, again, not a surprise because they fear deportation, jail, etc. So what problems do Black undocumented immigrants face? First thing is erasure. They're not involved or they're not included in the conversations around the undocumented because the focus is most times on Latinos. Again, some of that is, well, obviously it's legitimate. I'm not saying that that obviously, if we go back to Mexicans as the example, it's a huge group of people. So they're going to be a large part of the conversation. But because people of African descent are never addressed in those conversations, many people, Black undocumented people that I've talked to, feel like, you know, people don't see us as undocumented, we're never thought about, and we're sort of left out of the equation. But these laws, DACA, et cetera, affect us too, but they're not perceived that way. Another thing I wanted to point out, which I didn't put in the slides, was that it was pointed out to me a couple of times by people from Belize and from other Central American countries who do identify as Black. They say, you know, the numbers in Mexicans the numbers have decreased steadily and our numbers have increased, but people can never conceive of us as being from these places that we're from. But we are. I've only ever been in Panama, or I spent my whole life in El Salvador or whatever, fill in the blank country, or Belize. So they're erased from the conversations, and they feel very much so as that they are. Also, a lack of resources. Like all people who are in this situation, there's a lack of resources. But oftentimes, I talked to some Black undocumented immigrants in a neighborhood I used to live in New Jersey. And they said, even when I go to access certain services that are supposed to be for people like me, I would get, you know, this sort of drilling like, why are you here? Why don't you speak Spanish? Why haven't I heard you speak Spanish? Are you sure you're from that country? And one woman said to me, I'm from Belize. We don't speak Spanish there. So there's a lot of ignorance around it. And sometimes there's a lack of resources, but sometimes when people try to access them, they are treated as if they're not supposed to be there. Then we won't even get into the intergroup dynamics because as one woman told me flat out, back in her country, and I want to say she was from Costa Rica, she identified as Afro-Latina. She said, you know, we have tensions between our groups there. So if I show up at the same place trying to access the limited resources for what is available for undocumented people like myself, I then have to compete with these white Latinos who treat me like crap because that's what they do at home. So this specter of racism within the communities is something is a hurdle and a barrier. The limited resources is a barrier. And then the racism within the wider American society is another barrier or hurdle that they have to overcome. Add to that language as well. And that takes me to my third point, is that they must deal with their immigration status plus the stigmata of race, as being of African descent, the burden of race and US racial history. An example I want to point out is Somalis and the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which so many people, including myself, felt was really ridiculous because it expanded the reasons that one could be deported, but it put so much emphasis on this one particular group of people in very unrealistic ways, so that they were almost required to sort of guess who was maybe involved in terrorism or who was doing something with, if someone's sending money through a hawala, oh, now all of a sudden you're aiding and abetting with terrorism and things like that. And people were like, oh my God, like I have to deal with being a Muslim, I have to deal with being Black. I now have to deal with these laws that feel really targeted, because guess what? They are targeted. They really are. There's no way around it. So Black undocumented immigrants have to deal with all those things. And again, I don't want to at all diminish what all undocumented immigrants deal with, but I want to just highlight the special things that people of African descent and visible African descent, when I say that, I'm talking about folks who are visibly what American society historically believes is African, what they must face. Why do I point that out? Because you have some people, I have Moroccan friends, for example, if they didn't tell you they were from Morocco, which is a country on the continent of Africa, you wouldn't know if they were Italian, you wouldn't know what they were. And in a society like the United States, where you have this history, this sort of special history for people of African descent who are visibly of African descent, someone who's from Morocco who looks sort of ambiguous, you don't really know what he is or she is, people use that to their advantage. I had a Moroccan friend who said to me, look, I'm I'm very proud of who I am. I consider myself African, but I'm really glad that I don't have to deal with people looking at me and adding that extra racism. Until she opens her mouth and she tells you, you would just think she was from Southern Europe. That is not an available escape to most and many Black undocumented immigrants. They face a lack of protection. So we know that the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is also called DACA, was rescinded in September 2017. The Trump administration decided to rescind the Obama administration's 5-year-old executive act. And this harmed all undocumented immigrants. This was really traumatic. I was teaching, and a lot of students in my classes, obviously I don't ask people their status, were affected by this. And I cannot begin to describe the depression they felt, the bewilderment. It was horrific. So this, again, is not something only faced by Black undocumented immigrants, but it certainly was felt by them. In December 2020, it was restored. We know that. TPS. TPS is a temporary status that is given to eligible nationals. It has to be designated by the US government. So there's no other way to be granted TPS status other than the federal government decides, okay, this country, Myanmar, is basically falling apart, Burma, which they still call it, it's falling apart. So we're going to extend TPS to their citizens who are here right now. But the problem with TPS is that it is very limited, and it is roll of the dice. It depends on what the current administration in office thinks. There's a lot of politicking around it, but currently, or as I should say, as of, because these things change all the time and I don't keep up with them, but as of March, El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Burma, Nicaragua, Nepal, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen had nationals from those places had TPS. Now, why we bring up TPS is because some people will come here, obviously legally, and then something happens at home, they get TPS, they stay. Now, if the US government decides, okay, you know what? Things seem to be okay back in Haiti now, so TPS status has been rescinded. You have folks say, look, I talk to my folks every day. It's still horrific there. I can't go back. Even if the US government has decided to rescind it, people make these decisions every day. I'm not going back. I can't. I'm the person who's making money here to send back home to my family in Port-au-Prince. If I go back, it's a mess there, and I won't be able to give money to my family. So then you have folks digging deeper into their undocumented status. Solutions. These are mostly my opinions, but I really feel wholeheartedly about them. We have to provide a way for people to legalize. There's never going to be a time, we'll never have enough money, resources, human resources to deport people or whatever ideas that folks have. Just kick them out or escort them out. It's not going to happen. It's not realistic. I think what needs to happen is exactly what President Bill Clinton did, and that is do an amnesty, just do a blanket amnesty and give people a grace period of time that they have to legalize. And then from that point, I think we need a large scale overhaul of our immigration system. It is long overdue. My entire adult life, I've been hearing about immigration reform, and it has not happened. We've had piecemeal here, piecemeal there, piecemeal here. And so even if one wants to do things the right way and be here legally and follow the laws, it's almost impossible to do that. So I had so many people in my old neighborhood. I used to live in Newark, New Jersey, in a place called Ironbound. And people would say to me with tears in their eyes, they knew me because I was their neighbor. They also knew I worked for Homeland Security. Talk about a level of trust, because they would just tell me these things. They would say, you know what, I came here with the best intentions. I had a visa. I came with an F1. I was studying English, but a series of events happened. And I went to try to do my papers. I was told that I was out of status and there was nothing I could do. I mean, we have so many loopholes. I saw that even as an immigration officer myself. Even if someone wants to do right, it is nearly impossible. So I think we need And I say that with great emphasis and frustration. And I'm not even an immigrant. It just really irritates me as an American that so many people live in the shadows because our immigration system is broken and has been broken for decades. So we need long overdue reform. TPS needs to be expanded and extended. I think more countries need to be included. I don't think an entire country needs to be on fire for you to say, okay, let's extend it to people from Yemen, because it is just that dire strait. We know that it takes very little in places that already have weak infrastructures, or in places that have presidents who decide to see themselves as dictators for life, to decide to go after one ethnic group, or to do all kinds of silliness that they do every day that makes a lot of people suffer. We need to realize that all those things that may not be as catastrophic as what we see in Yemen, the bottom doesn't have to completely fall out, but nonetheless, people cannot return to those places. So I think we need to expand and extend our definitions of what it means to give temporary status, also how long people can stay, and also, and not that this can really be done because there's nothing in writing saying that it is being done, but there's a deliberate, from what I feel, a deliberate slowness to dealing with countries where people are of African descent and extending TPS. I have often been frustrated with how Haiti was treated over the years. There are too many examples to even go into. Here's a country that is very close to our country. We share a lot of history. Everybody knows what's going on there 9 times out of 10 because it's on the news, because it's close enough that we cover it. And still the government will say, we're not really sure if they should get TPS. I've been in so many marches on behalf of Haitians over the years. I started as a child because it's just not fair. It's not right. So why do we quickly give TPS to some nations and not to others? I think we need to, I mean, again, there's no law to write about that because there is no law or nothing written that is dictating these actions, but it is something that is noticed. And I certainly, as a scholar of immigration law and history, believe that it's more than a notion that certain countries are often left out, or the bottom absolutely has to drop out before TPS is extended to them. That needs to change. I think all of us need to pressure the government at all levels. We need to lobby government officials. Every single one of us, we have city council members, we have districts that we live in, we have our senators, we have our representatives, and many of us, myself included, don't think to write those folks, don't think to call their numbers that they're always giving out to say, hey, I saw this on TV. I can't believe this is happening. As an American citizen, I want to say that I think, and as one of your constituents, you got to say that, I think A, B, and C should happen. That pressure actually really does work, but it takes a critical mass. And so we all have to feel that we have that power to pick up the phone, to mail a letter, or to send an email. And lastly, I would say, and this is definitely the Black multi-generational Americanism in me, we have to look after each other, community. I would not be sitting here, the descendant of hundreds of years of horrific, and you will never know the half of what we went through, history, if it were not for us looking after each other. And I would say that because we have a government that from the very beginning was not designed to protect us and never really did. So from my lived experience and from the group that I come from and looking at immigrants, I say we all still have to do that. We've got to take care of each other. Now, I know that groups do that within, I caught the tail end of the last presentation, and I heard one of the speakers saying what a Kenyan group that he belongs to, a Kenyan American group, and that's fantastic. But when it comes to people of African descent, we are dealing with a particular prejudice, stigma that is oftentimes reserved for people of visible African descent. And so therefore, it requires us to be a little bit superhuman, sadly to say, so that we have to organize, we have to take care of each other, but we have to go that extra mile in doing that. over other groups because of our history as a collective from descendants from that continent. I don't like it. It is a burden. It's heavy, but it is what it is. And so I think we need to rely on each other as communities and doing things like what we're doing today. And I'm not saying only people of African descent should do this. We all need to be community together, whether it's rallying against anti-Asian sentiments that are out of control right now, whether it's a targeted group against, targeting Muslims, or whether it's gender-based violence, whatever it is, we need community. The government is never going to take care of us only. And with that, I want to wrap up. I try not to make my presentations too long because I prefer the conversation, but I will go back and talk about anything that you want to discuss. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Scruggs. So as you know, you can post questions in the Q&A section. And we do have a general question right now by Margaret Lambs. And I think this is something we also will deal with during our last panel when we have different community organizers coming in to talk about the work that they do with undocumented immigrants, specifically Black undocumented immigrants. But do you know of any organizations working with undocumented immigrants to support them, getting access to services, and also getting more equitable, I guess, treatment than other immigrants do?
Mm-hmm. I do. I would need to pull that list together because I have it here. I'll admit to you, I started looking more at Black undocumented immigrants because of Bill Hing, who I had this conversation with. I tend to do immigration in general, but I never did much on undocumented immigrants, Black undocumented immigrants. I went to a conference also on Asian undocumented immigrants at Brown University, and my mind was blown open because I know they exist, obviously, and I have friends who are Black undocumented immigrants, but I never really thought about it. So I'm still new to this as well, but I will, for anybody, I will go, you see my email address, I'll make sure you have it, and I will gladly compile a list of organizations for you because they're out there.
Thank you. I have another question by Na. And he says, thank you so much for this piece. The question about Africans not thinking of themselves as Black really resonated with me. Mm-hmm. How do you think we can even start to address this gap in knowledge about the field of violence Black immigrants enter when they arrive in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I say it again, because it doesn't make me proud, guys. It's a weight around, it's a weight on all our shoulders, people of African descent, no matter how, when you arrived. As I keep pointing out, my family is about as American as it gets. As a joke, in one of my classes in Berkeley, a couple of friends and I took a DNA test. I am Black and American Indian. Family has been here hundreds of years, and I still face the same weight that many of my ancestors did. So I know how you feel, and I have a lot of Black immigrant friends. It is our, for lack of a better way to say it, it's our lot in life. It is the history has been set in terms of how we entered this part of the world en masse. And it is a very heavy history to overcome, whether you're talking about the United States or Brazil, where I've spent time, or Dominican Republic, wherever. It's heavy, and it's all these things tied to our skin. So what I say to African immigrants is, first of all, I understand why some people say, well, I'm not Black, I'm Igbo, or I'm not Black, I'm Somali, I'm not Black, I'm fill in the blank, right? Ndebele. I get it. You grew up in a place where that's not really an identity marker, right? So my ancestors also weren't running around saying, hey, I'm Black. This was projected onto them. A lot of times, and the reason I do this history part is because I've had so many people thank me because they said, I never heard this stuff before. I had no idea. The category of Black was made in the United States deliberately so that you could never escape. So we are the only country that had what we call the one drop rule. And that was purely so that you could always be owned bought and sold repeatedly, even if you were mixed with white, even if you were mixed with indigenous, like my family, no matter what. If you had one drop of Black blood, that was it. And so it created this identity that we could not escape. That's why if you look back at old pictures of Martin Luther King marching in civil rights marches, you'll see him with his arms locked with Lena Horne, who in any other country would be considered white, certainly not Black. But in the United States, you learned early, our ancestors learned, my fate is tied to someone like Lena Horne's or Halle Berry. We are in this together. And so that identity did not come up overnight. So I don't expect Africans who just arrive here to understand that. It doesn't make sense, because even in your own country, I'm Wolof. I don't have anything against anybody, but I'm Wolof, or I'm Maasai. But when you come to the United States, I say this all the time. I told you I lived in Abidjan. I love Cote d'Ivoire. I lived there for a year. I didn't understand a lot of things that I saw. I really didn't. But it was my responsibility to learn things about that society. So before I would say, oh gosh, why do they live like that? Look at the people in Trashville. Why are they dressed like that? Understand systems that people live in. And you don't have to do a deep dive, but just understand it's not that easy for people from certain ethnic groups. If your ethnic group is not ruling the government in many places, you don't have a voice. You have to understand that. So with Black Americans, a lot of what you see, obviously, yes, some people don't have a lot of drive. Some people are lazy. Some people, whatever, fill in the blank. These are human characteristics, but certainly not millions of people are just living a certain way because they want to. There are structures and barriers that are in place. And when you walk into, I always say you walk into other people's histories, you walk into all of that. So when I was in Brazil, till I opened my mouth, I was Afro-Brazilian. And all that was Afro-Brazilian that went along with that affected me. So what did I do? I watched myself. I understood that I shouldn't go to this neighborhood. I shouldn't do this after dark. If I go in that restaurant, people are going to look at me and how can she afford to be here? Which happened to me repeatedly. I think Africans, it's a lot to take in. So you're not going to be able to digest it overnight, and neither should you. And some things have changed. We're not static. That I don't deal with what my great grandparents dealt with. I knew my great grandparents very well. Thankfully, I was partially raised by them. But even some of the things that they told me don't quite fit for today. But what I do try to make sure that I do is I understand the history behind that. So for example, if you're trying to make sense of, why is it every single time it's just an accident that a Black man gets shot or a Black woman gets shot? Is it just, well, she should have just listened, should have put her hands up. Oh, you see, he reached down. Amadou Diallo, oh, he should have just listened. Why is someone shot 35, 40 times? But Dylan Roof, a young white man, teenager, I don't remember how old he was, 18 or 19, went into a church built by descendants of slaves in South Carolina, wrote in his diary, ooh, these people are so nice. They opened the door for me. They gave me cookies. We're drinking tea. Too bad I'm going to have to kill them. Sat with them, prayed with them, and then mowed them down. And then the police show up. This is in Charleston. The police show up. He takes them on a wild goose chase. They're able to apprehend him, not a bullet fired. He was hungry. They get him food to eat. Why does that happen repeatedly? But Tamir Rice, who's a little boy, is shot. Amadou Diallo, who was an immigrant from Guinea, who didn't even understand English very well, who's just trying to, he's scared, fumbling. Fulani doesn't understand English very well. I mean, this guy took multiple bullets. Why? So that's where that understanding the context that you walked into, not saying that you need to accept these stigmatas, not saying you need to see yourself as less than, not saying you have to identify with every single Black American, but what you must really understand is that my forebears who were related to you, and my Somali friend said, well, you didn't come from Somalia, I understand that, but the whole continent, these precedences, we still live with the weight of history. This is a country where for almost 300 years, people who look like us were considered property. That mindset does not go away overnight. So we all have a fight. And that's why I fight, and many of my Black American friends fight, Sometimes people say, well, why do you care? Are you Haitian? Are you an immigrant? Are you? No, but we have to care. We have to care because we know at the root of this is just the garden variety injustice and racism.
Thank you for that.
It's so sad to hear you use the truthful phrase garden variety. Unfortunately, it's so true. And you know, just what's happening is so shocking this week with Dante Wright and in the middle of this Chauvin trial. Dr. Scruggs, so, you know, when first things, I just want to point out to Karina, who's the director of migration studies, that when I first met you, you presented yourself to me, truthfully, I'm sure, as somebody who was studying global migration. And I just want to point that out to Karina, because especially if we're still teaching at least partially by Zoom, we should have Dr. Scruggs teach in our migration studies program. At any rate, I want to put you on the spot a little bit because of your conversation on temporary protected status, and you know, of course, who can forget the foul language that Donald Trump used in describing African countries that were at that time getting TPS. Anyway, I agree with you 100% in terms of that we need to put pressure on who, how, and why TPS is or isn't granted to certain countries, especially Haiti. And here's the part where I'm putting you on the spot. Given your background and your connections, I don't know how to put this. It seems like you're well positioned to deliver this message.
You would think. One thing I learned while working at the UN, and I was a little bit, I think, ignorant to this. Let me just back up and say that I started out, the reason I was living in Abidjan was because I was training for the Foreign Service. And I thought I really wanted to be a diplomat. I'm so glad that I went there because I needed to go just for my spirit as a person of West and Central African descent. It was the best thing I ever did. But I realized that the government is so, it's so bureaucratic. So even if you have the ear of really important people, there are other important people they talk to who, if they don't agree and it's not the right election year or the constituency wouldn't agree, it's really hard to get things done. I do feel, I know the people that I worked for in the past, particularly two of them are very thoughtful people who care about these issues. And one of them is in charge of domestic policy now. And I have so much faith in her because she gets the race part. Her family is, her father was Black American descent from the same lineage as my family. And her mother's family had immigrated from Jamaica. She gets it. She understands. She's very thoughtful. She's a brilliant woman. So I have my fingers crossed. I also think that President Biden is a very thoughtful person, but I get dismayed by how much it takes to get stuff done. I don't have that kind of power. I really wish I did, but.
Thanks. I'm not going to let you off the hook. I'm going to be lobbying you privately.
You can do that.
So I'm thinking about what you discussed so thoroughly, you know, that I would say the racist roots of the law, the term citizenship and belonging in this country, you know, and has informed obviously immigration policy from its inception. And I'm curious to think in terms of us really rethinking what it means to be an undocumented immigrant, right? As you said, mostly when we think of an undocumented immigrant, we think of a Mexican immigrant. Because as you say, that the change doesn't really occur from the top, right? You don't have, you say, I wish I had the power to change everything, but would it change for our communities to really rethink how we connect or identify as a form of political consciousness as well? And could that be something that can whether we try to redefine ourselves and our communities as a way, as a political strategy, for example? Is this a possibility?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the Black American story, you know, nobody gave us anything. So I think if people look at the civil rights movement, they say, oh, wow, that was so great. When I was in Brazil, people always said this. I love Afro-Brazilians. They're so sweet. And they're always very deferential to the history, the way it's unfolded in terms of the civil rights movement here. And so many people will start talking to you about that when you talk to them. But people forget it. That was hundreds of years in the making. I just had this conversation with one of my Asian American friends who said, you know, we need to be more political. We need to speak out more, but it takes time to sort of build up that courage and to see yourself as having some kind of political power. Most immigrants who come from anywhere, regardless of race, really just want to fit in. They want to keep their head down. They want to make money. They want to keep it moving. They're not trying to identify with all the issues that are going on. If you tell them, okay, to make it, you got to not identify at all, or don't go around Black Americans and don't talk to this group and okay, fine. That's what they're going to do, because they're not here with the same agenda. We see differences in their children. The children are the ones you see, like a lot of the kids well, they're not kids, they kill me. They're 18 and over who I teach, who are the children of immigrants or who came here as children, and they're on DACA. They are a force with which to be reckoned. Even my Asian American friends, this idea of, you know, passive, I don't know any passive Asian women. My Asian friends, they are not to be messed with, but it takes time to develop that. I think particularly with Latinos, I think that it's happening. It's going to happen naturally. We're going to be forced to change our definitions just because of the sheer numbers. But I think with Latinos, it's interesting because something that I've been reading about, and maybe people here know better than I do, the difference with Black Americans, I will admit this, because we were, the way we were categorized, regardless of hair texture, skin tone, all this stuff, you're just Black. It was very easy for us then to have this cohesiveness. We always had class differences, and we still do. So I say that all the time to my immigrant friends who especially refugee friends who get resettled in not great neighborhoods. And they'll say, you know, Natoschia, I don't mean to be rude, but all the Black Americans I live around, they stand on a corner, they do this, they do that. That's a certain segment of society that they're being exposed to, because that's where they've been resettled. I always tell them, there are 46.8 million people who identify as Black in America. I assure you there is a big Black middle class. You just don't live around them, right? So I lost my train of thought. Let me go back. Oh, okay, sorry. But even with our class differences, you know, you had W.E.B. Du Bois over 100 years ago saying, listen, the talented 10th, the one in every 10 Black person who's educated and has good manners has to take it upon him or herself to educate, you know, other Black people. We always had this, but it was still easier because we had more cohesiveness. And that's what President Biden eloquently just said when he said, oh, you know, Blacks are the same types of voters, and people got really angry with him. But what he was trying to say was that we have this more unified history. With Latinos, it's a little more complicated. You know, Puerto Ricans don't necessarily see their fate bound to people who are coming from Central America undocumented. So that is something that I don't know how that will play out, because I just read that Trump actually got more Latina women, or Latinas or women, votes the second time around than he did the first. And I'm always saying, who are those people? Not that you don't have a right to vote as you wish, but I'm just curious, who are those people? And I've heard some pretty vitriolic things against immigrants coming over the southern border. And the most vitriolic things I've heard were from other Latinos. So it's different when you talk about nationalities. You know, we just say, oh, or Asians or Africans, but that's complicated. You have people coming from Nigeria, over 300 languages, different ethnic groups. People don't see themselves that way. My ancestors didn't see themselves that way. They were forced to see themselves that way. So over a period of time, by the 1700s, we were the great grandchildren of Africans. People don't realize that. So, you know, some of my friends tease me and say, oh, Black Americans are the least African. Why? Yeah, if you know our history, you know why. They kept taking people into the Caribbean and into Brazil. So you were getting people pretty late into history. In the United States, for the most part, no. So these identities were forced on us. But I wonder what will happen with the Latino community.
Yeah. Adobe, you want to jump in here on
Yeah.
this topic?
Thank you, Dr. Scruggs. I just have a question. I know that at some point the city of San Francisco called me and they were asking me how we classify North Africans. And my answer was said a very blunt one. I said, listen, you know, if you're from any country which is a member of the African Union, then you're an African. Right. And then I went on and said, or if your country participates in the African Cup of Nations, you know, of soccer, then, you know, you're definitely an African country. But the reality is that, you know, North Africans are now classified as Middle Easterners, right? And I've seen a few North Africans, you know, complaining against it, but at the same time, because you're being classified as Middle Easterners, they're also classified as white, right? And at the same time, I've also seen some other North Africans, you know, being very happy about it. So, I mean, from your perspective, you know, with your experience, expertise, you know, how do you read, you know, this classification of North Africans?
There's a history behind that. People actually sued the government to be considered white. And I'm trying to think, I don't know of any North Africans who did it, but there's certainly stories about Syrians when they first came in. We had a very exclusive definition of who belonged. That's why I do the historical part. That's very old. So if you were not white from Northwest Europe, you weren't considered, you weren't in, right? So that's even Italians, that's Irish Catholic, even though Ireland is in Northwest, they were still treated, and Greeks, they're not really white. I mean, it was very exclusive. So as people came in, and especially if they weren't Christian, they did everything to be considered white. I think that I see that a lot, actually. And in fact, I don't assume I know how people identify, because on the one hand, they want the perks from things that are given to Africans or set asides for African immigrants, but nobody wants to be us, right? As a comedian so famously would come out and say, raise your hand if you want to be Black for a day. Nobody wants to carry that. I get tired of carrying it, but I think, you know, I don't know. I understand it. I get frustrated when I travel through those countries, because they certainly, you know, on the one hand, they'll say, oh, we're all Africans. On the other hand, they can be quite racist, quite nasty. But then when they find out I'm Black American, then it's a little different. And I refuse that. I don't like to be treated differently. I purposefully braid my hair. Sometimes I lie and I'll say I'm from Zimbabwe, I'm from Sudan. I make up things because it shouldn't depend on that, right? And the fact is, I am still connected to these people who you're treating like crap and you don't even know. But it's not, of course, it's not everybody. I lived in Egypt for 2 years. I encountered people who, just as horrific as some people could be, other people could be really nice. They have their own, they're a lot like Latinos when it comes to that, I would say. They have their own issues around identity. And a lot of that was also thrust upon them, right? So this idea that you're Arab, when now there's a huge movement, I'm sure you know about it, people saying, no, I'm Berber, I'm not Arab. So, you know, I'm respectful too of the things, other people's histories, right? It's easy for me to stand on the outside and just say, oh, you know, you're not down with us or whatever. I get it. This is a real mind job that we all went through with colonization, slavery, all this stuff. It's not easy to navigate these things, but I think we need to be respectful of each other's struggles. And also, if you're not going to be down for fighting the battles and for the struggle, then you should not benefit from anything that's given.
And I just wanted to add, you know, one more thing is I think you stress it very well. The experience of being a Black immigrant, right? And like you said, you know, this is a double-fold experience, right? Being Black and being an immigrant. And yet, at the end of the day, you know, anti-Blackness doesn't care whether you're from Zimbabwe or you're from New Orleans,
right?
And I think that, you know, I don't know if you could speak to. We've said it, but I think we should never stop, you know, talking about it. You know, the importance of creating or bridging the gap between African Americans and Africans, because at the end of the day, our fate is the same. You know, if you look at the carceral system, you know, I mean, we're impacted. And Professor Manuel Pastor said how Black immigrants, you know, in detention, in ICE detention, are treated differently. And that's not, you know, that really makes people think back about the days of slavery. So, I mean, how would you? I know that, you know, we can definitely talk about the importance of bridging the gap, but, you know, how do we go about it? Because, you know, I think that's the key thing. You know, the reason, yeah, is there, but, you know, how do you do it? If you could share something about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of ignorance on all sides. I think one thing I took away from going to Abidjan, I was in my early 20s. I remember I'll tell you this real quickly. I got into the limousine that the embassy sent for me. And there was one long road, and I lived in Deux Plateaux, and the car was driving me there. And I just started crying. I started crying. I started weeping because I just kept thinking, I've never seen Black billboards, Black cartoons, everything was Black. I just never seen that. And I spent time in the South and all that, but it does something to the psyche. So there's a lot of ignorance on all sides. You're not really taught a lot about us. We're not really taught a lot about you. Also, Africans have to understand too that our ancestors were castigated, punished, looked down upon for being proud to be Black or being proud to be African. Sorry, they were African first. You were, you know, laughed at, your hair was laughed at. And so some of this, what you're seeing is us in rebellion. I'm the first generation after civil rights. You know, I'm not wearing my hair straight. I don't want to wear my hair straight. That's right. You know, if you go to my website at the university where I teach, I have a profile and I'm showing my nappy hair purposefully because I'm proud of that. But it took us hundreds of years to get to the point where we said, you know, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. This was not overnight. There's a lot of ignorance on all sides. So we don't understand. A lot of us learn about you like Africa is one big country. We're very naive. We're American at the end of the day. Americans in general don't spend a lot of time studying other people. And then a lot of Africans don't know much about us. They don't know much about other African countries. So they make a lot of comments. They see some people in their neighborhood, or they say, oh, you know, all of you sell drugs, all your baby mamas, this and that. I'm like, no. My grandmother went to university. Who are you hanging around? But we don't see each other. There's so many of us too. There's so many of us. I think we definitely have bridges that we need to forge with each other. But I'll tell you, I'm always impressed. And I think it is because of the specter of global anti-Blackness. Like, even if you don't want to get along, you just know. You know, when I'm in airports, I was traveling through Asia, traveling through Latin America, you see another Black person, you're not, I mean, you just know whether you want to be together or not, we are in this when it comes to the ignorance that we face. And so we tend to rally around events that happen, like Amadou Diallo and Louima, Abna Louima, the Haitian man who was beaten by the police and had all kinds of horrific things done to him. Nobody had time to be, oh, well, you Haitian, nobody cared. We were all out in the street. Hey, you going to that Abna march? I mean, people just, you know, they were out there. I think Black Americans tend to get it a little faster than most Africans I know, just because, again, those of us who are conscious are very aware of that long history, and our identities have evolved over time. Most people who just arrived from Africa they're not thinking about that. They can't think about that right now. Their children do, their grandchildren do. Some of my most, as we say, down friends who get it are children of African immigrants. So it happens, as I was saying to Karina, it happens over time. I don't know. I think with Black folks, the Black community, I think we do a pretty good job. I have to say, of course, there's work that can be done, but we tend to rally around events or holidays, or when something horrific happens, we put things aside. I know when Somalis were being mistreated in Maine, it took nothing for me, my Black Latino friends. We were just like, you know, taking off our earrings, greasing up our faces. Come on, we're taking the bus to Maine. And we were traveling en masse. It doesn't matter that I'm not from Somalia. It doesn't matter. I'm not from a clan. I don't care. I know what's at the root of this BS. And that's what it boils down to. And a lot of Puerto Ricans have that attitude as well, because they've been in this country for so long. You will see them, and I have a lot of respect for Puerto Ricans in the New York area, especially, very politicized over issues because they've just been in the trenches for so long and they get it. And I think it happens over time.
Thank you. We're running out of time, and there's so many questions still from. So I think I'd like ask one more question, and I think this is a little bit different from what you focused on. But France is asking. So she says, some immigrants I know came to the U.S. to escape oppressive, dangerous laws in their home countries. For people who are LGBTQ, is this part of the conversation or the data about immigrants coming into the United States from Africa?
Yeah, that's an added burden. I had a friend who from Kenya was able to get asylum because he was LGBTQI. That is an area I'm really proud to say, when I was an asylum officer, I almost always just blanketedly gave I granted asylum to people who were in that predicament identified as LGBTQI, because the ignorance is just astounding. So these folks have to deal with all the stuff that we just said, in addition to these crazy outdated ideas about what everybody needs to be doing in their bedroom and who they're supposed to love. I could not imagine, as a straight woman, I don't know what that feels like, but I certainly could empathize. And I did a bit of, I would do my history reading on countries. I'm like, this person can't go back to this country. This is crazy. It is an area of immigration law that is more pronounced now. I see much more on it now. The trans movement and community is, and actually the intersectionality of race and trans is, I'm impressed. I can't keep up. I don't have the language. I'm always asking my friends, I'm always afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. Because I don't have the language to speak to it. But what I do know is that when I was an asylum officer, when I was an immigration officer, I started hearing people then saying that there needs to be a ground for this, because and again, I saw people from the Middle East, Europeans. I had women sitting in front of me applying for asylum who have been beaten horrifically in Russia because they were LGBTQI. So in that case, it's not, oh, she's a white woman. She's a white woman who is a lesbian who got the crap beaten out of her and will not be protected if she goes back to her country. So this is an area that's really up and coming. There are organizations for anyone who would like information on that. There are a couple I have on the top of on my mind right now that I will definitely list them for you. And I think with the Biden administration, you'll see more pronounced protections, and you'll see it incorporated in any immigration laws that we do pass, hopefully.